And to have like an external framework, it would be nice to have like something about open science, the idea itself. What is it actually about? It's more than just a set of practices. There is a bigger picture, something with science and society and so forth. And I'll try to sort of weave this in. It's a very bold and ambitious approach, of course, but luckily there's already written a book about this by Frank Mediema, who is one of the, let's say, founding fathers of the open science movement, Dutch doctor, immunologist, and so forth. He has published a book on open science, the very idea, which I'll use as a backdrop to weave into this sort of historical approach, what this idea actually is, where does it come from? Is it an ideal? Is it an ideology? Where does this come from? Because it's older, we've been here before, and I think it's useful also to see these practices in a historical perspective. So of course, it's gonna be a selective approach. I'm gonna run through this book, 300 pages in like 5-10 minutes, but it'll give you a certain idea. And the first point is, of course, to talk about this thing called science. What is this thing called science? And if you go back to the scientific revolution with the development of modern science in the 17th century, it's important to emphasize that the whole point of science was to be open. So the concept of open science in that sense is a bit weird because science is supposed to be open. In the context at that time, it was all about opening up knowledge production from religion, power, politics, and so forth, not being private, but being public. So that was the whole idea of doing modern science in a way that was open and accountable to other researchers and to society. And it's not just about theory or method or logic or whatever, which is how this is usually represented in old school philosophy of science. It's also about the relation to society, how science should relate to society. That was also part of the discussion from the beginning. And the core idea about science being open is that it should have a public. This is also linked to the new invention, maybe the most important invention of the scientific revolution, publication. So to have a public, you need to publish. And what Royal Society did, which we saw, is also to start a journal. The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, published in 1667, still running. So this whole idea of being open and publish research to be accountable, to be criticized and shared with other people in other nations, internationally, this whole idea about openness in itself is one of the most important inventions of the scientific revolution. If we then make a long jump, we come to the 1930s. This social contract between science and society started to be contested, especially after the First World War. And during the mid-20s, there was a lot of criticism about science. There was fear about modernization, how new technology would threaten humanity and so forth, as illustrated by Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, which was from 1936 at this time. There was a huge debate also more academically on what was called the frustration of science, how different aspects of, let's say, science governance would hamper and hinder and close down research. It could be either because of industry control or state control. There was a growing understanding that most of science is actually not open. And according to some, only 75%, only 25% was actually open science for the people. Most of science was done for industry or dictated by states and so forth. So what we got in the 1930s was a much broader debate on science and society. What is the social function of science, which is a famous book by J.D. Bernal, published in 1939, which talks about all the topics that we talk about today, even publication, sharing of data, and so forth. How to open this up in a more broad sense. What are the social relations of science? Another book by J.D. Crowther, very important, published in 1942 during the war. And this whole movement aimed to raise a new awareness about the social responsibility of science, which is then the new concept. Science is not just open and collegial or cooperative, it also has to be responsible in relation to society. And I think one of the most important places where this idea or ideology was embedded by some people associated with this movement, in particular, the biologist Julian Huxley, who became the head of UNESCO in 1945, and Joseph Needham, biochemist, who became head of the science division in UNESCO in 1945. They basically embedded this ideology within the science division of UNESCO. So since then, UNESCO has been the stronghold for promoting this idea of open, collaborative, and responsible research. At the same time, of course, we have a third tendency, the rise of fascism in Europe, Germany, Spain, Italy, and which, of course, raises a whole new set of concern about the relationship between science and democracy. And this was addressed, of course, by everyone at the time. But I would like to highlight in particular one contribution by Robert Merton, an American sociologist at the time in 1942 when he published this. He was a professor at Columbia University in a new discipline called sociology. At that time, reflecting upon the history of science, the broader movement of the social responsibility of science, and also the new tendency of the rise of fascism, he published a very important paper in 1942, a note on science and democracy. It's a very important text, and I urge you to read it because it has become extensively misinterpreted in hindsight. It's usually been presented as some naive idealization of fundamental norms of scientists doing their own stuff, associated with the principle of the ethos of science. Universalism, communism, impartiality, organized skepticism, and so forth. But when looking on the context, it's very explicit that what Merton is talking about is that science is actually threatened. There's a new criticism on the integrity of science. We are about to lose science as we know it. And this urges us to make a new reflection. We actually need to stand up for science. And that's why he writes this text. And these are the 4 principles that he would argue that you need to stand up for if you want to stand up for science. That's the point of the whole ethos of science. It's not just about idealism or professors being independent from society and so forth. Anyway, this article also led to a very influential research program in the sociology of science in the 1950s and the 60s, where they studied empirically a lot of the things that we talk about today. Reward system, recognition systems, career publication pressure, assessment, and so forth. This was all studied empirically already in the 50s and the 60s. So this Mertonian tradition has a lot of contribution even today, I would argue. However, it becomes kind of academic and narrow and empirical. And what was going on in society wasn't always reflected in the academic disciplines. Because what we also have after the war is, of course, a very strong anti-war movement, disarmament movement, talking about bigger picture issues related to science and society. And this is just 2 points of reference. Of course, the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which led to a whole public movement of disarmament, highlighted perhaps with the pugwash movement and so forth, which also fed into the scientific communities. The other picture, as you might recognize, is from Kent State University, 1970, when the National Guard during the Vietnam War went into the campus and shot and killed 4 students. And this is also at the height of the Vietnam War, criticizing the military-industrial complex, the role of science and technology in war, and so forth. We need to discuss this, was kind of the whole thing. And some of these discussions, of course, also entered the more academic disciplines. So what we saw at the time was, again, books, people who try to sort of mediate between science and society, between the public debate and the more academic discussion. And these are just some of the examples from the time. John Simon's book from 1968 on public knowledge, Rose and Rose on science and society from 1970, and Jerry Rabbit's book on scientific knowledge and its social problems. These are books that try to highlight this need to discuss science and society and the role of social responsibility in research. Again, most of these tendencies did not become mainstream in the academy, but eventually what we got was a new field of STS, Science and Technology Studies, which sort of took on some of these ideas. And I'm not going into detail. It's a huge research field in itself, doing empirical studies of science and technology. But what is important is how they also eventually manage to influence policy. So what we can see in the programs of the European Union in particular, you can see how these ideas about science, society, social responsibility are being fed into policy programs. And this is just some sort of historical summing up of these different perspectives. It's done by a woman called Ulrike Schaut in a report on science and society from 2013. And she shows how the scope of the activity of the Commission has changed during these years, from late 80s, when there was a whole approach of sort of informing and monitoring the public, like finding information about them, towards raising awareness of science and technology in the late 90s, to more dialogue and participation and governance between science and society, and then from science and society to science in society, and eventually what you might know as RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation, which was the big slogan in the previous framework program, Horizon 2020. Now, this also within the Commission was followed by a narrowing down of perspectives and funding to the point where it didn't have the same momentum as it was perhaps envisaged. And at the same time, around 2015, we kind of get a shift in policy, because this is when open science enters the scene and kind of replaces this other approach and becomes the dominant paradigm for European funding. The report from 2015 from the Union laid the framework, and as we already saw from Rose-Marie's presentation, UNESCO is kind of still the global actor internationally with their open science policy from 2021. So this is a big framework, and it's also a reminder of why UNESCO still is the main protagonist, I would say, for promoting an open, collaborative, and responsible global science. So this is kind of the background and history for, according to this book, what leads us to the open science practices that we have today. What I find striking is that this is also pretty much the history and the background for why the Norwegian National Ethics Committees were established in 1990. As you might know, the Parliament decided at the time that we should have national committees for research ethics, as they would call it back then, to promote these kind of ideas in the research system. And since then, we've had 3 committees, NEM, NESH, and NENT, covering these different aspects. And they have had this function of raising awareness about social issues and ethical questions related to science. Later, we also got GRU, Granskingsutvalget, which is a scientific misconduct committee. We have a skeleton committee focusing on human remains and indigenous knowledge and so forth. But the overall picture is that since 1990, we've had these national committees, and their main role is to support researchers and research institutions so that they can take responsibility. So this is not hard governance in the sense that you have to comply to rules and regulations to get funding and so forth. This whole system is in accordance with principles of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. We guide researchers and research institutions so that they better can take responsibility. The main tool for doing that are the guidelines. The different committees produce different guidelines. NENT, NEM, Skeleton Committee, and NESH. These are guidelines developed for researchers to be used in training and research by themselves. And this brings us then to the NESH guidelines, which are the one that is being produced by NESH, the committee for which I'm the secretary. And the NESH guidelines was first introduced in 1993. And since then, it has been revised and updated numerous times in accordance with new questions or technologies or social issues. And the last revision was done in 2023, the English version available since 2024. And as you can see, it has some of the same structure as the ROSI guidelines, starting with the research community. Then there's an emphasis on the research participants, groups and institutions. There's a huge part on commissioners, funders, and collaborators. And there's a strong emphasis on the dissemination of research as well. So it kind of follows the whole research cycle, but it has some different emphases, which are interesting when we come to compare them. It consists of then 50 guidelines, hopefully covering most of the relevant topics. We hoped until we saw the ROSI guidelines, because there's so much more. But the outline here is what you see, these 50 guidelines. And it's important to emphasize that these are not rules that you have to follow one by one. It's slightly aspirational, and the main aim is to inspire reflection, not just to do the right thing, like in practice, but also to think through what is responsible, because a lot of times you have to weigh and balance different good intentions or principles against each other, and that's when it becomes hard. Then it's not enough just to have a rule-following exercise. You also need to be able to balance and reflect on what is the proper approach, what is responsible. So that's where ethics becomes kind of different from other codes of conduct, which regulates practice. This is more about reflection and taking responsibility before you act in a way. Now, looking on the guidelines from the perspective of open science and the ROSI guidelines, it was really interesting to reread them, because it then becomes so evident that openness is such a core value, both in science and in the guidelines. So when I read them now, it's just like openness about this and openness here, openness. And you can tell that from the first page on the introduction that this is all about promoting open science. But also it should be openness, for instance, when it comes to communicating risk and uncertainty. And the more you go through the guidelines, you'll see that there is openness in assessment, in publication, openness to the public, to stakeholders, and so forth. So it's quite self-evident that openness is itself a core value. And this is also emphasized in the footnote, where you will recognize both the ethos of science and the UNESCO declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. This is basically the foundation of this way of thinking ethically about research. But I think the main contrast, the point where these guidelines, which is for social science and humanities, might be richer than the ROSI guidelines, would be on the emphasis on the research participants, which is quite obvious because the ROSI is like general and this is quite specific. So the part on research participants, how do you treat people with respect? How do you inform people properly? How do you get the consent which is valid? How do you treat? And this is a very much more emphasized part in the NESH guidelines compared to the ROSI guidelines. And also, there are frameworks like the GDPR. Yes, it exists, but the challenge is, of course, how do we balance the urge for openness or ethical approaches? How do we balance that with legal frameworks like the GDPR? And in this way, also, I would argue, the NESH guidelines goes much further. How to crack open the GDPR, how to find loopholes in the legal things so you can make responsible research in a responsible way. So we kind of tackle those things more head on, in a way, I would say. There's also a much stronger emphasis, I would say, on the dissemination of research, not just fostering inclusion, but for strengthening democracy as such. It's embedded in fundamental principles of freedom of expression, freedom of information, and the whole idea that we need to bring the public in and share knowledge with the public for science to prosper and for society to prosper in relation to science. So this brings me to what is then maybe an attempt to sort of compare these things and just see how they kind of complement each other. I think that the obvious strength of the ROSI guidelines is, of course, the extensive knowledge on open science practices, which is the core part 4, which outlines all the different places in which we can open more. Publication, data, assessment, so forth. This is something which didn't exist before, and it's a very important contribution, I would say. It also ties very nicely in with the ALIA Code of Conduct, which we saw. The ALIA Code of Conduct is kind of narrow. It has a kind of limited approach to research integrity, basically the integrity of the research, the knowledge, not so much concerned about research ethics, the participants, nature, society. The main focus is on research integrity, with the additional emphasis on investigations of misconduct. So there's a sort of a nice approach with a sort of a more strict framework, because how do you investigate misconduct? That's a very important part of ALIA, which is where I think ROSI opens up much more. Like, yes, we should do that, but we should also think broader about society and open practices, not just this narrow focus on misconduct and open investigation of misconduct. What I think is, if we then look at the guidelines from Norway, it becomes evident that they are quite different. First of all, ALIA and ROSI are European, transnational kind of resources. This is a Norwegian thing, which also has the strength that it links to Norwegian laws and institutions. ALIA and ROSI are general for all disciplines. This is for social science and humanities. But there's also an interesting distinction that ALIA and ROSI are codes of conduct. They focus on practice, how to change practices, while the NESH guidelines, which is more embedded in ethical reflection, invites a responsibility to true reflection. How may we think? How may we balance? How may we approach? How may we justify? And how may we expand the freedom of research by pushing these ethical principles as far as possible? So I think there's a nice complementarity between these three sets of guidelines, and I hope we can discuss this further. And there's especially then, it becomes a tension. What do we really mean when we say as open as possible and as closed as necessary? Our argument has been that, well, it's not closed. Closed sounds so bad, like it's not open as a positive thing and closed as a bad thing. For us working on ethics, it is as open as possibly and as responsible as necessary. For instance, when we speak about privacy, that's not a bad thing to close down. It's like necessary to find a balance between openness and privacy. We might discuss more whether commercial interest or security interests are equally justified as barriers for openness, but these are bigger discussions that we need to have. But I think the slogan, as open as possible, as responsible as necessary, is better than closed. And then, of course, in these days, with security politics, geopolitics, and so forth, we also have to take into account that we are in a regime now where we are as open as possible, but as secure as necessary. So these are different ways of framing this, and I hope we can discuss this further throughout the day. So thank you very much.